In Beijing, the polished hall of the Chinese Foreign Ministry once again becomes the stage for a message directed at Brussels and beyond.
Cameras roll, notebooks open, and every word carries the deliberate precision of diplomacy.
At the lectern stands Mao Ning, spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whose voice has become a familiar echo in the hall of global trade disputes. The day's question centres on metal, but the weight of it goes far beyond the element itself. Nickel, a crucial material for electric vehicles and high-tech manufacturing, has become the latest flashpoint between China and the European Union. The EU has announced a sweeping investigation into Anglo American's proposed sale of its nickel assets to MMG, a Chinese-controlled mining company. Brussels calls it a matter of strategic scrutiny. Beijing calls it something else, politicization. Mao Ning steps forward, the Chinese flag and the ministry's emblem forming a backdrop that says everything about the seriousness of the message. Her tone remains steady, professional, but unmistakably pointed. She begins with a reaffirmation, one that has become the foundation of China's trade narrative. China always supports Chinese enterprises in implementing practical cooperation in various fields based on the principle of mutual interest and a win-win situation. Her voice carries the measured rhythm of someone accustomed to choosing words that can travel across languages and continents. She continues, "We hope that the parties involved will honour their commitment to openness, respect the principles of a market economy and fair competition, refrain from politicising and securitizing economic and trade issues, and provide a fair, transparent and non-discriminatory business environment for companies from all countries." Each phrase is deliberate. Refrain from politicising, non-discriminatory business environment. These are not just lines. They are the coded language of modern economic diplomacy, echoing Beijing's growing frustration with what it sees as Europe's increasingly protectionist stance. The deal at the centre of this dispute involves Anglo American, one of the world's oldest mining giants, and MMG, a Hong Kong-listed firm under the control of China Minmetals Corporation. The acquisition would give MMG access to nickel mines in strategic regions, assets vital to the future of green technology, batteries and defence materials. In Europe's eyes, this is about security. In China's, it's about fairness. For Beijing, such investigations have begun to feel like a pattern. Only weeks ago, the EU launched anti-subsidy probes into Chinese electric vehicles, arguing that state-backed industries were distorting global competition. China responded sharply then, and it is responding sharply now. Analysts in both Europe and Asia see this as part of a broader trend, the weaponization of trade, under the banner of economic security. It's a phrase that appears increasingly in Western policy papers, and one that Beijing believes undermines the spirit of globalization that once united these same economies. As Mao Ning speaks, her statement is not only for the journalists in the room, it's aimed squarely at the policymakers in Brussels, who must now decide how far Europe's strategic autonomy will go. Behind the diplomatic phrasing lies a deeper frustration, a sense that Europe is drifting closer to Washington's position, treating Chinese capital and technology as threats rather than opportunities. Outside the foreign ministry, Beijing's skyline glows under the late autumn haze. The capital moves with its usual rhythm, but for China's policymakers, the rhythm of global trade is shifting. Every new investigation, every barrier, every regulatory hurdle is read as part of a broader attempt to contain the country's economic rise. Experts in Beijing note that China's message today mirrors its broader diplomatic strategy. Project Calm, emphasize openness and portray itself as a defender of fair competition. The phrase win-win cooperation has become almost ritual in its repetition, but in a world where trade routes are being redrawn and supply chains reshaped, it carries a tone of quiet resistance. At the same time, European officials defend their stance as necessary oversight. Nickel, they argue, is not just a commodity, it's a critical resource tied to Europe's green transition. And in a world increasingly defined by supply chain vulnerability, the EU insists it must ensure that foreign acquisitions do not compromise strategic autonomy. Yet to Beijing, that logic feels dangerously close to economic nationalism. In her remarks, Mao Ning doesn't name Anglo American or MMG directly, but her choice of words leaves no ambiguity. The principle at stake, she implies, is not about one deal. It's about whether economic engagement between China and Europe can still function on the basis of trust. Across the Pacific, Washington watches carefully. The US has long urged its allies to scrutinize Chinese investment in critical industries, from semiconductors to minerals to ports. The EU's decision to probe the nickel deal appears aligned with that view, deepening Beijing's suspicion that economic cooperation is now increasingly filtered through geopolitical lenses. In recent years, Beijing has worked to diversify its sources of raw materials, investing heavily in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Nickel, essential for lithium-ion batteries, is at the heart of that strategy. Indonesia has become a central partner, and Chinese firms already dominate much of the processing infrastructure there. The Anglo American MMG deal, by contrast, represents an attempt to expand that network into regions historically dominated by Western companies. From a business perspective, the deal makes sense. From a political one, it's combustible. The EU's investigation could delay or even derail the sale, depending on how regulators interpret MMG's ownership structure and its ties to state-owned enterprises. In Brussels, officials stress the need for due diligence. In Beijing, officials see it as discrimination. In her concluding remarks, Mao Ning returns to familiar ground principles that China repeats in nearly every economic dispute: openness, fairness, non-discrimination. Her closing sentence underscores the underlying tension. China does not seek confrontation, but it will not accept what it views as unfair treatment. Around the world, markets watch closely. The global demand for nickel remains volatile, and every diplomatic spat sends ripples through commodity prices. Investors note that the EU's decision could have unintended consequences, pushing China to accelerate its resource partnerships elsewhere, or even prompting retaliatory reviews of European firms operating within the mainland. The larger question, though, extends far beyond minerals. It's about whether the world's two largest trading blocs, China and the European Union, can maintain a relationship grounded in cooperation rather than suspicion. With every probe, tariff and restriction, that relationship grows more fragile. In this context, Mao Ning's press conference becomes more than a diplomatic routine. It becomes a reflection of a global realignment, one in which economic power, environmental responsibility, and national security have become inseparable. Her calm delivery belies the tension beneath, the growing sense that trade, once the unifying force of globalization, has now become one of its deepest dividing lines. For China, the message is clear: fairness must not be conditional. For Europe, the question is equally stark: can openness survive in an age of strategic caution? As the press conference ends, cameras fade, notebooks close, and the world returns to parsing every word of Beijing's statement. In the corridors of Brussels, policymakers will weigh their next steps, how to balance security concerns with economic necessity. In Beijing, the response has already been delivered: refrain from politicizing and securitizing economic and trade issues. The phrase may sound technical, but in the lexicon of global diplomacy, it's a warning. Trade, trust, and transparency, three ideals that once defined the promise of globalization, are now being tested by the politics of minerals and the diplomacy of metals. From Beijing's perspective, fairness is not a request, it's an expectation. And as nickel becomes the latest symbol of that expectation, the standoff between China and Europe reminds the world that the battle for economic influence is no longer fought in factories or ports. It's fought in the language of regulation, investigation, policy. In the days ahead, both sides will continue to speak of dialogue, cooperation, and shared growth. But beneath those phrases lies an unmistakable reality. Every new probe deepens mistrust, and every diplomatic statement, no matter how carefully phrased, hints at a world moving further from the economic optimism of the past decade. As the lights dim in the press room, the echo of Mao Ning's voice lingers calm, deliberate, and unmistakably firm. Her message is not only to Europe, but to the global stage: China will defend its right to participate in the global economy as an equal partner, and it expects the same openness it once offered to others. For now, the cameras have stopped rolling. But the story of nickel and the geopolitics wrapped around it has only just begun.